Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're exploring something that has puzzled scholars for over a century. The Sumerian records, among the oldest written documents in human history, never describe a true beginning of civilization. They speak as if the story has already started, as if memory itself resumes mid-sentence. We'll move slowly through this absence, listening not for what was said, but for the shape of what remains unspoken. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Whether you're settling into sleep or simply letting history wash over you, I'm grateful you're here. Now let's begin. There is something deeply unsettling about the earliest Sumerian tablets when they are read slowly, without rushing toward interpretation. These clay records, hardened by fire and preserved across millennia, do not behave as we expect the opening chapter of civilization to behave. They do not announce themselves. They do not marvel at newness. They speak instead as if order already exists, as if the world they describe has been running for some time before anyone thought to write it down. Cities appear already named. Institutions already function according to rules no one explains. The sensation is subtle but persistent, like stepping into a conversation that began long before you arrived, where everyone else seems to know the context you've somehow missed. Picture yourself in the scribal schools of ancient Uruk, where young students sat cross-legged on packed earth floors still cool from the night. The air would have carried the smell of wet clay, that distinctive mineral scent that clings to the hands and never quite leaves the workspace. Lamplight flickered against mud brick walls, making shadows dance across rows of apprentice scribes bent over their work. The only sounds were the soft scrape of reed stylus on clay, the occasional cough, the rustle of reed mats underfoot. In this quiet room, knowledge passed from one generation to the next, not through stories of how writing began, but through the methodical copying of texts already ancient when these students learned them. The tablets they copied listed professions, objects, animals, cities. They assumed these things already existed. They did not explain their origins. To be a scribe was not to invent but to preserve, not to question but to transmit accurately what had been given. The Sumerians left behind thousands upon thousands of documents. Administrative records tracking grain harvests, temple inventories, legal disputes, royal inscriptions, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, hymns to gods, epic poetry. This abundance might suggest a civilization eager to explain itself, to declare its achievements. Yet within all this written material, something fundamental is missing. There is no account of writing's invention, no myth describing the founding of the first city from bare earth, no story of how agriculture began or how kings first came to rule. Instead, what we find are records of harvests already being managed by established temple bureaucracies, measurements already standardized across regions, legal codes already presupposing generations of precedent, social hierarchies already firm and unquestioned. The world described in these texts does not struggle into being. It appears fully formed, already organized, already old. This has long been treated as an inconvenience of preservation. Scholars often assume that earlier texts simply haven't survived, that the true beginnings lie somewhere beneath the ground, eroded by time, dissolved by groundwater, scattered by millennia of environmental change. And certainly this is partly true. Much has been lost, but even allowing for catastrophic loss, the tone of what survives remains deeply strange. These are not documents written by people discovering fire or marveling at the first planted seed. These read like maintenance logs kept by caretakers of a system they inherited. The scribes record what is, but they never explain how it came to be. There is no sense of wonder at novelty, no pride in recent achievement. There is only the steady work of documentation, of keeping track, of preserving order against the constant threat of forgetting. Consider the Sumerian King List, one of the most famous and frustrating documents to survive. It opens not with a first human leader rising from among equals, but with a declaration that kingship descended from heaven. Before any city is built, before any human community is described, authority already exists as a cosmic principle. The first rulers are assigned reigns of 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years. These numbers defy literal interpretation. Modern scholarship dismisses them as mythological, symbolic expressions of antiquity, but even stripped of their literal meaning, the structure of the list reveals something important. It does not begin with chaos needing order. It begins with order already established, kingship already functioning, transferred from one city to another as an inheritance. Authority in this telling is not created by human need or human ingenuity. It arrives complete, descends from elsewhere, and moves through history already knowing its own nature. After the flood, the king list continues with shorter reigns, numbers that begin to approach historical plausibility. Rulers who reigned 400 years give way to those who ruled 100, then 50, then durations we might actually believe. This transition is often described as the shift from myth to history, from symbolic time to actual chronology. But the text itself never frames the transition this way. It does not announce a new beginning, does not say that now, finally, we arrive at real history. Instead, it suggests continuity interrupted. The flood does not birth civilization. It produces it. Kingship continues afterward, but under tighter constraints. Life becomes shorter, the world becomes smaller. What follows the flood is not a fresh start but a diminished continuation of something that existed before. Walk with me for a moment through the ruins of Uruk. As they would have appeared in the late 4th millennium, the city spreads across marshy lowlands, where the Euphrates once flowed, though the river has long since changed its course. Reeds grow thick along vanished channels. The ground underfoot is packed earth mixed with countless shards of pottery, so common they are barely worth noticing. Walls rise around the sacred precinct, massive constructions of mud brick that took generations to build and generations more to maintain. The air is heavy with moisture and heat. Smoke rises from cooking fires, carrying the smell of fish and bread made from barley. In the distance, the white facade of the temple catches the afternoon light. A structure already ancient in its design, following patterns established so long ago that no one questions them. This is not a new city finding its way. This is a city that knows itself, that has rules, hierarchies, rituals that govern every aspect of life, and nowhere in its vast archive of tablets is there a story of how Uruk came to be. There are only records of how it functioned, year after year, harvest after harvest. The myths that survive compound the strangeness. The Atrahasis epic, often cited as a Sumerian creation story, does not actually describe creation in the way later traditions would. When the story begins, gods already exist, already organized into hierarchies of labor. They are tired of their work. They need helpers. So humanity is fashioned, not from love or wonder but from necessity. People are created as a solution to a labor problem. The narrative focus is not on the miracle of human existence, but on the administrative challenge of managing divine workload. Humans appear already embedded in a system older than themselves, obligated from their first breath to roles they did not choose. There is no celebration of human potential, no declaration of humanity's special nature. There is only the statement of function. You are here to work. The cosmos needed you, so you were made. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous surviving text from ancient Mesopotamia, assumes the world is already old. The poem opens with Gilgamesh ruling Uruk, the city, whose walls are already legendary, already admired for their antiquity and strength. Gilgamesh is not a founder but an inheritor. He is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a figure caught between realms, but he does not establish civilization. He lives within it. When the story looks backward, it does not describe humble beginnings. Instead, it gestures toward a time when gods walked more closely among humans, when boundaries between divine and mortal were softer, when life itself was richer and less constrained. When the narrative looks forward, it does not promise progress. It warns of limits, of mortality, of the inevitability of forgetting. Gilgamesh seeks immortality and fails. His journey teaches acceptance, not transcendence. The walls of Uruk, built by ancestors whose names are half remembered, become the true legacy, not conquest, not innovation, only the patient construction that allows a city to endure. The archaeological evidence deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Southern Mesopotamia shows signs of sudden urbanization in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. Cities appear and expand rapidly, displaying levels of planning, architectural sophistication, and bureaucratic organization that seem to arrive fully formed. Yellow grows from a small settlement to a major urban center within what feels like historical eye-blink. There are precursors, certainly. There are earlier villages, earlier experiments with irrigation, earlier developments in pottery and tool-making. But the leap to true urbanism remains striking. The material record mirrors the textual strangeness. Civilization seems to accelerate, rather than slowly accumulate, as if some threshold was crossed that allowed rapid consolidation of technologies and social structures that had been developing separately. Some scholars point to environmental factors. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic transformations to the region. Sea levels rose gradually over millennia, flooding the Persian Gulf basin, which had once been dry land, potentially displacing populations and forcing migrations. River systems shifted, climate patterns changed. The memory of such upheavals could echo faintly in flood myths, in stories of lost homelands, in the persistent sense that civilization exists in the aftermath of something larger. In this view, Sumerian civilization represents not a beginning but a regrouping, a recovery from displacement, a consolidation of knowledge carried by survivors who had to start over but who remembered fragments of what came before. Others suggest that older settlements lie beneath water or sand, erased by time and environmental change. The absence of evidence becomes part of the explanation. When texts fail to describe origins, it may be because those origins were already distant, obscured by catastrophe, or simply by the passage of centuries in a landscape that does not preserve. Memory does not begin at zero. It resumes where survival allows. There is also the matter of the knowledge itself. Sumerian mathematics operates in base 60, a system of remarkable sophistication. This system appears early and remains stable. No text explains its development. It simply exists, used by scribes who were trained in its application but who did not record its invention. Legal codes assume long-standing norms about property, marriage, injury, and compensation. These codes are refinements of existing practice, not revolutionary declarations of new principles. Astronomical observations follow cycles that require generations of careful record-keeping to establish. Yet the earliest texts present this knowledge as already understood, already integrated into the calendar, already governing ritual life. Everything feels inherited rather than discovered. Perhaps most tellingly, many Sumerian words for social roles, technologies, and religious concepts have no clear etymological roots within the Sumerian language itself. They appear as isolated terms resistant to analysis, suggesting they were borrowed from earlier languages now lost. Language itself carries ghosts. Words persist after the cultures that coined them have faded from view. The Sumerian vocabulary is full of such words, technical terms, and institutional names that seem to come from somewhere else, from a linguistic substrate that predates the texts we can read. The emotional texture of the surviving material reinforces this sense of inheritance. Sumerian literature is marked by caution, by reverence, by a constant awareness of fragility. The gods are powerful but also unpredictable. They can withdraw their favor, cities can fall, knowledge can be lost. Civilization is not portrayed as humanity's triumph over nature or chaos. It is portrayed as a delicate arrangement that must be continuously maintained through correct ritual, proper measurement, and careful transmission of inherited forms. There is pride, but it is restrained. There is confidence, but it is always shadowed by the knowledge that what has been built can be unmade. This awareness surfaces most clearly in the prayers and lamentations. When Sumerian poets address the gods, they do so with humility that borders on anxiety. They ask to be remembered. They plead for their city's name to endure. They express fear that divine attention might turn elsewhere, that protection might be withdrawn. The underlying terror is not of physical destruction alone, but of being forgotten, of the city's memory being erased, of the structures that give life meaning simply dissolving as if they had never been. This is not the voice of a civilization confident in its permanence. This is the voice of a people who have seen collapse, who know how quickly order can unravel, who understand that continuity is never guaranteed. The silence around beginnings starts to feel less like an accident and more like a reflection of this deeper awareness. If civilization is fragile, if it has already been interrupted once or many times, if the present order exists in the aftermath of something greater, then perhaps speaking too confidently about origins would be dangerous. Perhaps the Sumerians chose not to explain beginnings because they understood that what came before does not validate what exists now. Authority must be maintained in the present, through alignment with divine will, through ritual precision, through social cohesion. Looking too far backward might reveal uncomfortable truths about discontinuity, about loss, about the impossibility of full recovery. The sensory world they inhabited reinforced this sense of living within constraints. Stand in the heat of a Mesopotamian summer, when the sun turns the sky white and the air becomes difficult to breathe, the earth cracks. Plants wither. Water becomes precious. Survival depends on the irrigation channels dug by previous generations, on the communal labor that maintains them, on the social agreements that govern their use. There is no margin for error. A broken canal means famine. A dispute over water rights can destroy a community. Civilization here is not an abstraction. It is the difference between life and death. And it rests on knowledge passed down, on techniques refined over generations, on cooperation that transcends individual lifetimes. No one person could build this system. No single generation could invent it. It exists because it has been maintained, because each generation has accepted the discipline of preservation. At night, when the heat finally breaks, the sky fills with stars that move in patterns the priests have tracked for centuries. These patterns govern the calendar. They determine when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals that maintain cosmic balance. The stars do not explain themselves. They simply are, moving through their courses with regularity that allows prediction. The Sumerian relationship with the heavens is not one of wonder at mystery, but of attention to pattern. The sky is a clock, a calendar, a guide. It tells time but does not reveal origins. It marks cycles but does not explain why those cycles exist. This cyclical understanding of time itself works against origin narratives. In a world where seasons repeat, where festivals return annually, where the same rituals are performed generation after generation, the concept of a singular beginning loses importance. What matters is not when something first happened, but that it continues to happen correctly. The New Year festival does not celebrate creation. It renews order. It realigns the present with cosmic pattern. Past, present, and future collapse into a single moment of ritual performance that transcends linear time. The Sumerians built their civilization within this understanding. They were not trying to start something new. They were trying to maintain something old. Their greatest fear was not stagnation but deviation. Innovation existed, but it was cautious, incremental, always justified as recovery of a more authentic form rather than creation of something unprecedented. Even technological advances were often attributed to divine gift rather than human cleverness. The plough was taught by the gods. Irrigation was revealed in dreams. Writing itself, that most fundamental technology, simply appears in the record without fanfare, without a story of invention, as if it had always been there waiting to be used. So the question remains, suspended in the silence of the tablets. If the Sumerians did not see themselves at civilization's beginning, where did they understand themselves to stand? If they inherited systems they never claimed to invent, what came before? And why, when they finally developed the ability to record their thoughts permanently in clay, did they choose documentation over explanation, preservation over origin story, maintenance over mythology of creation? Did they choose documentation over explanation? The answer, if there is one, does not lie in what they said. It lies in what they carefully, deliberately did not say. It lies in the silence itself, in the space where beginnings should be but are not, in the absence that shapes everything written around it. Tonight we walk slowly through that silence, not seeking to fill it, but learning to listen to what it might mean. The scribes who preserved these records worked in rooms that smelled of damp clay and lamp oil. Their hands moved with practiced precision, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft tablets that would harden in the sun, or be baked in kilns for permanence. Each mark was deliberate. Each sign carried weight. But what is most revealing about these scribes is not what they chose to write, but how they were trained to write it. The education of a scribe was an education in repetition, in fidelity to established forms, in resistance to deviation. Students copied lists that had been copied by their teachers, who had copied them from their teachers in an unbroken chain, reaching back beyond memory. They learned to write the names of cities, professions, tools, and gods in exactly the prescribed way. They memorized standard formulas for contracts, hymns, and administrative records. Creativity was not encouraged, accuracy was everything. This training reveals something about how the Sumerians understood knowledge itself. Knowledge was not something to be expanded endlessly through innovation. It was something to be preserved carefully against the constant threat of loss. The scribe's role was custodial. He was a guardian of forms that existed before him, and would, if he did his work correctly, exist after him. The content of these forms was less important than their continuity. A list of professions did not need to explain why those professions existed. It only needed to transmit their names correctly so that the social order they represented could persist. In the cool hours before dawn, when the city still slept and only the temple precincts showed signs of life, priests would perform rituals whose origins they did not question. They poured libations in prescribed amounts. They recited prayers in archaic language, whose meaning had grown obscure. They followed procedures passed down through generations of religious specialists. The precise movements mattered. The exact words mattered. But the reasons behind them had receded into a past no longer accessible through explanation, only through performance. To perform the ritual correctly was to maintain connection with divine order. To understand its origins was unnecessary and perhaps impossible. This ritualized relationship with knowledge extended to law. Legal codes from ancient Sumer do not present themselves as innovations. They frame themselves as clarifications, as written records of norms already understood. When a judge decided a case, he did not invent a principle, he applied precedent, he sought alignment with established practice. Even when kings proclaimed new legal codes, they described themselves not as legislators but as restorers of justice that had been neglected. Law came from somewhere older than any living person. The king's role was to make it visible again, to write down what the gods had always intended. This posture appears again and again across different domains. In mathematics, in astronomy, in architecture, in agriculture. Each field operates according to inherited principles. The Sumerians made advances, certainly. They refined techniques, improved methods, achieved remarkable sophistication in many areas, but they did not frame these advances as breakthroughs. They framed them as recoveries of knowledge that had always existed, that had perhaps been partially lost and was now being restored. Progress was backward-looking. It sought to align the present with an older template rather than to strike out toward unprecedented futures. The temples themselves embodied this backward orientation. When a temple needed to be rebuilt, enormous effort went into maintaining its original form. Foundation deposits were carefully examined, previous building phases were studied. The new structure was intended to replicate the old as exactly as possible, even if that old form was no longer optimal for current needs. To deviate too much would be to risk divine displeasure. The gods had accepted worship in temples of a particular design. Changing that design might change the relationship. Better to preserve the form, even if its origin was lost to time. Stand in the shadow of a temple wall in the hour when the sun begins its descent. The mud brick holds warmth from the afternoon, radiating it back slowly as the air cools. The surface is smooth where plaster covers the brick, rough where the plaster has cracked and fallen away. These walls have been rebuilt many times. Each generation adds a layer. The temple grows taller. The platform beneath it rises. But the ground plan remains constant. The doorway faces the same direction it has always faced. The sacred chamber sits in the same relationship to the courtyard. The dimensions follow ratios established so long ago that no one remembers who established them or why. To maintain this form is to maintain connection with the divine. To alter it would be to drift into unknown space where protection cannot be assumed. The Sumerian relationship with the gods reflects this same caution. The gods are not distant abstractions, they are present, involved, demanding. But they are also unpredictable in their particulars even while remaining predictable in their patterns. A god may grant favor or withdraw it. A city may prosper or decline based on divine disposition. The task of humanity is not to understand the gods but to maintain proper relationship with them through ritual, offering, and obedience. Understanding would require a kind of intimacy that the texts never claim. The gods remain other, powerful, necessary but ultimately opaque in their deepest nature. This opacity extends to the divine realm itself. The pantheon is complex, filled with gods whose relationships and relative authority shift across different cities and time periods. There are creation myths, but they are fragmentary, contradictory, and never systematized into a single authoritative account. Enki creates humans in one text. Ninmah shapes them in another. Namu gives birth to the gods in a third. These variations are not resolved. They coexist, each valid within its own context. The Sumerians did not feel compelled to create a unified theology that explained everything. They allowed multiplicity, ambiguity, and regional variation. Different cities honored different gods as primary. Different myths served different ritual purposes. Unity was not the goal. Function was. This functional approach to myth means that stories about origins serve specific purposes, rather than establishing universal truths. A myth about the creation of humans explains their relationship to the gods and their obligation to labor. It does not attempt to answer every question about human existence. A myth about the ordering of the cosmos establishes divine hierarchy. It does not explain where the gods themselves came from. Each narrative does its work and stops. The gaps between narratives are left unfilled. The Sumerians seem comfortable with this incompleteness in a way that later cultures often were not. The silence around civilization's beginning fits within this pattern. An origin narrative for civilization itself would have to be totalizing in a way the Sumerians avoided. It would have to explain too much, unify too much, claim too much certainty about matters beyond direct experience. The Sumerian approach was more modest. They recorded what they knew through direct observation and inherited tradition. They maintained what worked. They did not speculate about what they could not verify. This restraint becomes even more striking when compared to how other ancient cultures handled the same questions. Later Mesopotamian traditions after Sumerian had ceased to be a living language, show increasing interest in systematization and explanation. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, presents a far more comprehensive cosmology than anything in the Sumerian corpus. Describes the generation of the gods from primordial waters, the conflict that leads to creation, the establishment of cosmic order through divine combat. It provides answers. The Sumerians, by contrast, had provided questions without answers, fragments without synthesis, practices without justification. Why this difference? Perhaps the Sumerians, being earlier, had not yet developed the intellectual tools for systematic theology, but this explanation feels inadequate. The mathematical and administrative sophistication of Sumerian culture suggests they were perfectly capable of systematic thinking. More likely, they had different priorities. They were not trying to understand the cosmos comprehensively. They were trying to maintain their place within it. These are distinct projects requiring distinct approaches. Imagine walking through the marketplace in mid-morning when the heat has not yet become oppressive. The air carries the smell of fish brought up from the marshes, of bread baking in clay ovens, of dates drying in the sun. Voices call out prices and negotiate trades in a language that flows like water, soft consonants and liquid vowels. No one here is discussing the origins of civilization. They are living it, participating in exchanges governed by customs so old no one questions them. The standard measures for grain, the expected ratio of exchange between barley and silver, the social hierarchies that determine who speaks first and who defers, all of this simply is. It functions. To ask where it came from would be as strange as asking where the river comes from. The river is there, you use it, you do not demand it explain itself. This lived quality of civilization, its embeddedness in daily practice, makes origin narratives less necessary. Origin stories often emerge in cultures experiencing discontinuity, in moments when the present feels disconnected from the past, and people need a story to bridge the gap. The Sumerians, despite the catastrophes they certainly experienced, maintained enough continuity that the gap never became unbridgeable. They could trace their practices back through their grandparents to their great-grandparents and beyond into a past that faded gradually rather than breaking sharply. The world they inhabited was the world their ancestors had inhabited. It had changed, certainly, but not so radically that it required re-explanation. The annual flood cycle reinforced this sense of continuity within change. Every year the rivers rose, spreading water and silt across the fields. Every year they receded, leaving behind soil enriched for planting. Every year the same sequence of agricultural tasks had to be performed at the right time in the right way. This cycle was older than memory. It predated civilization, leaving behind soil enriched for planting. Every year the same sequence of agricultural tasks had to be performed at the right time in the right way. But civilization had learned to work within it, to anticipate it, to use it. The flood came not as disruption but as renewal, as the world returning to itself. In such an environment, time feels less linear than circular. Events repeat. Patterns return. The idea of a single beginning becomes less meaningful than the idea of continuous cycles that have always been turning. Even the catastrophic floods remembered in myth fit within this cyclical understanding. The Yetzer flood narrative in Sumerian literature describes a massive inundation that destroys civilization, but it does not describe the permanent end of the world. After the flood, life resumes, cities are rebuilt, the gods re-establish order. What changes are the conditions, the constraints. Humans live shorter lives. They are subject to tighter control, but the fundamental structure persists. The flood is a reset, not an ending. It demonstrates that even apparent finality is temporary, that the cycle continues beyond what seems like total destruction. This resilience in the face of catastrophe speaks to something deep in the Sumerian worldview. They had learned, perhaps through bitter experience, that collapse is never final. As long as some knowledge survives, people remember how things are supposed to work. Civilization could be destroyed and rebuilt. Cities could fall and rise again. What mattered was preserving the knowledge that allowed reconstruction. This is why writing became so important. It was a technology of survival, a way to ensure that essential knowledge outlasted any single generation, any single catastrophe. But writing is selective. It preserves what is written down and lets everything else fade. The choice of what to record shapes what survives. The Sumerians chose to record administrative details, ritual procedures, legal norms, mathematical calculations. They recorded the practical knowledge needed to maintain civilization. They did not record speculative philosophy or comprehensive history. This was not an accident. It reflected their priorities. What needed to survive was not explanation but technique. The tablets speak in a voice that assumes shared understanding. They do not explain basic concepts because they were written for people who already knew them. A field record assumes the reader understands the measurement system, the property laws, the relationship between the temple and agricultural land. A ritual text assumes familiarity with the gods, the calendar, the purpose of the ceremony. These were internal documents, records for people already inside the system. They were never intended as explanations for outsiders or for distant futures. This internal orientation means they do not provide the context that later readers desperately want. We come to these tablets as outsiders, as people separated from the Sumerian world by thousands of years and vast cultural distance. We want them to explain themselves. But they were not written to explain themselves. They were written to function within a living culture where explanation was unnecessary. The silence around beginnings is partly this silence of assumed knowledge. The Sumerians did not write down what everyone already knew. And if everyone already knew that civilization had always been there, more or less as it currently was. But there is another layer to the silence, one that goes deeper than simple assumption. The Sumerians seem to have been aware that certain knowledge was dangerous, that certain questions were better left unasked. This awareness surfaces in myths where humans who seek forbidden knowledge are punished or destroyed. It surfaces in the careful control of information by priestly classes, who guarded access to texts and training. It surfaces in the repeated emphasis on boundaries, on knowing one's place, on not overreaching. Wisdom in Sumerian literature often means knowing what not to pursue as much as knowing what to pursue. If beginnings were seen as a form of forbidden knowledge, as something that belonged properly to the gods rather than to human inquiry, then silence makes sense. To claim knowledge about ultimate origins would be to claim a kind of authority that no human could legitimately hold. Better to accept ignorance in this domain, to acknowledge that some things lie beyond human reach. This acceptance does not indicate lack of curiosity. It indicates a different kind of wisdom, one that recognizes limits and respects them. The night sky would have reinforced this sense of human limitation. The stars move in patterns too vast for any single lifetime to comprehend fully. Yet through centuries of observation, patterns emerge. Priests could predict celestial events, could mark time by stellar movements, could find meaning in configurations of planets and stars. But this knowledge came through patient accumulation of data, not through sudden insight into first causes. The sky did not reveal its origins, it revealed its patterns, and patterns were enough. In the cool of evening, when work ceased and families gathered for the evening meal, stories would have been told. Some of these stories survive in written form, but most vanished with the voices that spoke them. We can imagine children asking their grandparents about the old days, about how things used to be, about the times before. The answers would have passed into oral tradition, shifting slightly with each telling, losing details, gaining embellishments. Some stories might have gestured toward beginnings, toward first times. But if these stories existed, they did not survive the transition to writing. Either they were not considered important enough to record, or they were deliberately excluded, or they simply never achieved the fixity that writing requires. Oral tradition is fluid. It adapts to present needs. A story told in one generation might emphasize different aspects than the same story told 2 generations later. This fluidity works against the preservation of clear beginnings. Over time, the beginning recedes, becomes uncertain, loses its sharpness. What remains are the patterns, the moral lessons, the emotional truth. The exact historical moment when something first happened becomes less important than what that something means now. The Sumerians moved from fluid oral tradition into fixed written record at some point in the late 4th millennium. This transition was gradual and probably not experienced as revolutionary at the time. Early writing was purely administrative, tracking goods and transactions. Only later did it expand to include literature, law, and religious texts. By the time writing was sophisticated enough to record myths and histories, the oral traditions that might have contained clearer origin stories had already been shaped by centuries of retelling. The beginnings were already lost in the mists of oral transmission before anyone thought to write them down. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete. It accounts for absence, but not for the particular quality of that absence. The Sumerian silence around beginnings feels deliberate, not accidental. It feels like a choice, even if that choice was made collectively and unconsciously over generations rather than by any single author or institution. The choice was to ground identity in continuity rather than origin, in maintenance rather than creation, in cyclical return rather than linear progress. This choice shaped what was valued enough to preserve and what was allowed to fade. The material culture reinforces this impression. Sumerian art is remarkably conservative. Styles persist for centuries with only minor variations. Seals carved in the early 3rd millennium look similar to seals carved hundreds of years later. Sculptural conventions remain stable. Pottery forms show gradual evolution, but rarely dramatic innovation. This conservatism extends to architecture, to urban planning, to the layout of temples and palaces. Change happens, but slowly, incrementally, always with reference to what came before. The past is not something to be overcome. It is something to be honored through replication. This replicative impulse appears even in how cities were rebuilt after destruction. Ur was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across its long history. Each time, the new city rose on the ruins of the old, following the same basic plan, maintaining the same sacred spaces, rebuilding temples on the same platforms. The city accumulated height as generations of rebuilding layered one atop the other, but the horizontal organization remained remarkably consistent. This vertical stratification creates a literal archaeology of continuity, where each layer references the layer beneath it, where the past is not erased but built upon. Walk through the ruins now. Thousands of years after the last Sumerian voices fell silent, the wind moves across eroded walls, carrying dust from the surrounding desert. The sky is enormous, empty of everything but light and heat. Beneath your feet, pressed into the earth, are the traces of countless lives. Sherds of pottery scatter across the surface, so common they crunch underfoot. The walls that still stand are weathered smooth, their original sharp edges rounded by millennia of wind and rain. Everything feels old, not in the sense of ancient but worn, of tired, of having endured beyond reasonable expectation. This is what remains after continuity finally breaks, after the maintenance becomes impossible, after the last generation that remembers how to preserve gives way to generations that no longer know or care. The Sumerians feared this ending. They feared being forgotten. Their literature returns again and again to the terror of erasure, of a name being lost, of a city's memory dissolving into silence. This fear drove them to write, to build in permanent materials, to create monuments that would outlast flesh. Yet even this effort at permanence was constrained by their understanding of limits. They did not believe anything human could last forever. They knew cities fell. They knew languages died. They knew that even stone could be worn away by time. Their monuments were not declarations of eternal triumph. They were hopeful gestures against inevitable loss. This awareness of inevitable loss colors everything. It produces a literature that is restrained, careful, almost melancholy in its quietness. Even hymns of praise are tempered by recognition that the God being praised could withdraw favor at any moment. Even celebrations of victory are shadowed by knowledge that victory is temporary. Even administrative records, dry and factual, carry the implicit understanding that they exist precisely because memory alone is insufficient, because without the tablet, the transaction would be forgotten and chaos would return. The gods themselves are portrayed as subject to limits. They are powerful but not omnipotent. They are wise but not omniscient. They can be deceived, defeated, or convinced to change their minds. The Sumerian pantheon is not a hierarchy of perfect beings but a community of powerful entities who negotiate, compete, and cooperate. They establish order, but that order is always provisional, always requiring maintenance. Even divine authority is not absolute. It must be continuously reasserted through action. This model of limited divine authority shapes how human authority is understood. Kings do not rule by inherent right. They rule because the gods have chosen them, and that choice can be revoked. Royal inscriptions are full of anxiety about maintaining divine favor, about performing correctly the rituals that sustain legitimacy. A king who loses divine support will fall, no matter how strong his army or how full his treasuries. Authority flows from above, and what flows from above can also be withdrawn. In practical terms, this meant that kingship was always conditional. A ruler had to prove continuously that he deserved his position. He did this through military success, through proper religious observance, through just governance, through building projects that honored the gods. But none of these achievements guaranteed permanent security. Each generation started over. Each king had to earn legitimacy anew. There was no sense that authority, once established, would automatically pass intact to successors. This conditional quality of authority mirrors the conditional quality of civilization itself. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is permanent, everything must be maintained. The world could end, not through dramatic apocalypse but through gradual decay, through the slow accumulation of small failures in maintenance. A canal not cleaned, a ritual not performed, a law not enforced, a text not copied. Each small failure makes the next failure more likely until finally the whole structure becomes unsustainable and collapses not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet settling as everything simply stops working. The Sumerians had seen this happen. Their history is marked by cycles of flourishing and decline, of cities rising to prominence and then fading, of dynasties establishing power and then losing it. They knew from direct experience that nothing human lasts without constant effort. This knowledge shaped their worldview profoundly. It made them cautious. It made them conservative. It made them focus relentlessly on preservation. But preservation has a cost. What is preserved tends to harden into rigid form. What is maintained tends to resist change. Over time, the Sumerian system became increasingly inflexible, increasingly bound by tradition, increasingly unable to adapt to new circumstances. This rigidity may have contributed to Sumerian decline, as the language gave way to Akkadian and the culture was absorbed into broader Mesopotamian civilization. By the second millennium, Sumerian was no longer spoken in daily life. It survived only as a language of religion and scholarship, studied by scribes who learned it as we might learn Latin, as a dead language whose importance was historical and cultural rather than practical. Yet even in death, Sumerian influenced everything that came after. The writing system persisted. The mathematical system persisted. Legal concepts persisted. Religious ideas persisted. The Akkadians, who succeeded the Sumerians as the dominant culture in Mesopotamia, adopted Sumerian gods, Sumerian myths, Sumerian administrative practices. They copied Sumerian texts and translated them. They honored Sumerian tradition even as they transformed it. The form of civilization that the Sumerians had worked so hard to maintain continued long after the Sumerians themselves had vanished as a distinct people. This persistence speaks to the success of their strategy. By focusing on preservation rather than innovation, by encoding knowledge in durable forms, by creating systems that could be transmitted across linguistic and cultural boundaries, the Sumerians ensured a kind of immortality. Not personal immortality, not even cultural immortality in the sense of their identity surviving intact, but the immortality of forms, of patterns, of ways of organizing human life that proved useful enough to be adopted by successor cultures. The absence of a true beginning in the Sumerian record then becomes less puzzling when viewed through this lens of preservation and transmission. A civilization oriented toward maintaining forms rather than explaining origins will naturally produce records that emphasize continuity over genesis. The silence is not a failure of memory but a reflection of priorities. What mattered to the Sumerians was not where civilization came from, but how to keep it functioning across generations that would face the same challenges, the same environmental pressures, the same threats of collapse. This pragmatic orientation extends even to their treatment of time itself. The Sumerian calendar was lunar, tied to observable celestial cycles rather than abstract numerical systems. Months began with the new moon. Years were named after significant events rather than numbered sequentially from a fixed starting point. This produces a sense of time as a series of recurring patterns rather than a linear progression from origin to destination. Each year was its own entity, defined by what happened within it, not by its distance from some mythical beginning. The past accumulated but did not build toward anything. The future would bring more of the same. More floods and harvests. More conflicts and resolutions. More births and deaths, endlessly cycling. Within such a temporal framework, the concept of a singular beginning loses coherence. If time loops back on itself, if the cosmos operates through eternal recurrence, then asking when civilization began is like asking when a circle starts. The question assumes a linearity that the Sumerian worldview does not contain. For them, civilization had always been cycling through its patterns. Sometimes those patterns were disrupted, sometimes order collapsed and had to be restored, but the pattern itself was eternal, built into the structure of reality rather than invented at some point in the past. This eternality of pattern helps explain another curious feature of Sumerian literature: its resistance to historical specificity. Events are described but rarely dated with precision. Kings are named but their reigns often blur together. Battles are mentioned but their exact circumstances remain vague. The record preserves what happened but not always when or in what sequence. This might seem like carelessness, but it reflects a different understanding of what matters. The specific historical details mattered less than the patterns they exemplified. A king's victory demonstrated divine favor. The exact year of the victory was less important than the principle it illustrated. Modern historians, trained to think in terms of cause and effect, of specific dates and sequences, find this frustrating. We want to know exactly when Gilgamesh ruled, so we can place him in a chronology, so we can understand his relationship to other events. But the Sumerian record resists this kind of precision not because the information was lost but because it was never the point. Gilgamesh mattered not as a historical figure who can be dated, but as a symbol of kingship, of human limitation, of the relationship between mortality and achievement. When he lived was less important than what his story taught. This symbolic rather than historical approach to the past pervades Sumerian thought. Figures from the distant past are remembered not for what they actually did, but for what they represent. The antediluvian kings with their impossibly long reigns are not historical records gone wrong. They are symbolic representations of a time when the world operated under different principles, when boundaries between human and divine were softer, when life itself was richer and fuller. The numbers are not meant to be believed literally. They are meant to convey otherness, to signal that the past was fundamentally different from the present in ways that cannot be captured through realistic description. After the flood, reigns become shorter, more plausible, but they are still symbolic. Each king represents a moment when divine favor manifested in human form, when order was maintained or restored, when the proper relationship between heaven and earth was enacted. The list of kings is not primarily a historical document. It is a theological statement about the nature of authority and its divine origin. Reading it as history misses its purpose, which is to demonstrate that kingship itself is eternal, descending from the gods, moving through time as a constant principle even as individual rulers rise and fall. Imagine sitting in the evening coolness after the day's heat has broken, listening to an old man recite the names of kings who ruled before anyone living was born. His voice rises and falls in rhythmic patterns, each name receiving the same measured attention, the same respect. The listeners do not interrupt to ask for dates or details. They know the purpose of the recitation is not to convey information, but to connect the present to the past, to demonstrate that the current king stands in a line of authority stretching back beyond memory to the moment when the gods first granted kingship to humanity. The recitation performs continuity. It enacts legitimacy. It does not explain because explanation would weaken its power. Some truths are diminished by analysis. The Sumerian approach to knowledge contained this understanding. Not all knowledge should be made explicit. Not all questions should be answered fully. Some things should remain in the realm of implication, of gesture, of understood but unspoken agreement. This is particularly true of origins. To speak too definitively about beginnings would be to claim a kind of comprehensive understanding that no human could legitimately possess. Better to remain silent, to gesture toward a past that recedes beyond clear vision, to acknowledge that some things are known through their effects rather than through direct observation. The gods knew the beginnings. The gods had been present when order was first established, but the gods did not share this knowledge completely with humans. What they shared were the forms that must be maintained, the rituals that must be performed, the boundaries that must not be crossed. They shared enough for humans to function within the cosmic order, but not enough for humans to understand that order comprehensively. This partial knowledge was sufficient for survival and possibly safer than complete knowledge would have been. Mythology reflects this pattern of partial revelation. Gods share certain aspects of divine wisdom with favored humans, but always incompletely, always with crucial elements held back. Enki, the god of wisdom, is particularly associated with this selective transmission. He teaches humanity useful arts. He reveals necessary knowledge, but he also guards secrets, keeps certain powers in divine hands. When Inanna steals the divine powers or attributes that structure civilization, this is portrayed as transgression, as theft rather than gift. The knowledge exists, but its transfer is problematic, requiring trickery and creating conflict. Knowledge does not flow freely from divine to human realm. It must be negotiated, earned, sometimes stolen, and even then it comes with conditions and limitations. This model of restricted knowledge circulation suggests that the Sumerians understood information itself as a form of power that must be controlled. Not everyone should know everything. Different classes of people had access to different levels of knowledge. Priests knew things ordinary people did not. Scribes knew things that remained hidden from those who could not read. Kings knew things that their subjects did not. This hierarchical distribution of knowledge helped maintain social order. If everyone had equal access to information, the distinctions that structure society would dissolve. Origins, in this context, might have been considered restricted knowledge, appropriate for gods, or perhaps for the highest levels of the priesthood, but not for general circulation. Writing down a comprehensive account of how civilization began would have democratized that knowledge in ways that might have been seen as dangerous. The written word, once created, can be copied, transmitted, read by anyone with the skill. Perhaps the silence around beginnings reflects caution about putting certain ideas into circulation where they might be misunderstood or misused. This interpretation finds support in the way other restricted knowledge was handled. Certain rituals were performed behind closed doors, visible only to initiated priests. Certain texts were kept in temple libraries with limited access. Certain aspects of divination and magic were taught only to trained specialists. The Sumerian approach to knowledge was not egalitarian. It assumed that different kinds of information were appropriate for different audiences, and that social stability depended on maintaining these distinctions. If the origin of civilization was considered sacred knowledge, knowledge that belonged properly in divine or priestly domains, the administrative texts, the legal codes, the economic records that make up the bulk of surviving material would not contain such knowledge because those texts served different purposes. They documented the practical functioning of society. They were meant for officials, merchants, and judges who needed to know how to apply rules and manage resources, not for people seeking ultimate explanations. Even the literary texts, the myths and epics that survive, may have been intended for specific contexts rather than general consumption. They might have been performed at festivals, recited in religious settings, taught to scribes as part of professional training. Their audience would have been people already embedded in Sumerian culture. People who shared a framework of understanding that did not need to be spelled out. These texts could assume knowledge rather than providing it because they operated within a living tradition where much remained tacit, understood without being stated. The night would deepen around such performances, the stars brightening as the sky darkened, torches and lamps creating pools of light in the gathering gloom. Voices would carry across open courtyards, chanting verses that had been chanted for generations in the same spaces, to the same rhythms. The audience would know when to respond, when to remain silent, what gestures to make at certain moments. The performance was participatory, binding community together through shared ritual action rather than through shared understanding of origins. This communal aspect of Sumerian culture is easy to overlook when reading isolated texts. The tablets we have are fragments extracted from a living whole, preserved by accident and circumstance, interpreted by people separated from their original context by vast chasms of time and culture. We read them as isolated documents when they were originally parts of larger systems of meaning that included music. The meaning was not in the text alone, but in how the text functioned within a complex cultural matrix. Within that matrix, origins may have been present in ways that did not require explicit textual articulation. They may have been embedded in ritual cycles, in architectural symbolism, in patterns of seasonal celebration, in the very layout of cities. The ziggurat rising at the city's center might have embodied cosmological principles that everyone understood without needing written explanation. The procession routes might have traced sacred geography that reenacted mythological events. The agricultural calendar might have recapitulated cosmic rhythms that linked human activity to divine order. If origins were present in these embodied, performed spatial ways, then writing them down would have been redundant at best, reductive at worst. The lived experience of participating in Sumerian culture would have conveyed a sense of place within cosmic order more effectively than any text could. You would know your civilization's relationship to the gods not through reading, but through participating in festivals that aligned human time with divine time, through living in cities whose very structure reflected celestial patterns, through eating bread made from grain grown in fields blessed by rituals connecting earth to heaven. This embodied knowledge is precisely what is lost when a culture dies. Texts survive, but the lived context vanishes. We have the words, but not the music, the buildings, but not the understanding of how they were used, the images, but not the rituals they accompanied. The Sumerian silence around origins may be partly our silence, our inability to perceive meanings that were obvious to participants, but invisible to outsiders reading fragments thousands of years later. Yet even accounting for this gap, something essential remains missing. Other ancient cultures, facing similar problems of textual preservation and cultural distance, nevertheless produced origin narratives that survived. The Egyptians described creation emerging from primordial waters. The Babylonians, inheriting much from the Sumerians, nevertheless developed elaborate creation mythology. The Simsira, the biblical tradition, produced Genesis with its systematic account of cosmic and human origins. These cultures felt the need to articulate beginnings explicitly, to commit them to written form, to ensure they would be remembered. Sumerians, despite their sophistication, despite their evident intellectual capacity, despite their extensive literary output, did not do this, or if they did, those texts did not survive or were not considered important enough to be copied and preserved. The absence persists across too much material, across too many genres, across too many centuries to be simply accidental. They must reflect something deeper about how the Sumerians understood themselves and their world. Perhaps they understood beginnings as fundamentally unknowable. Not unknown, but unknowable, beyond the reach of human cognition even in principle. In this view, asking about origins would be like asking what existed before the gods, a question that strains language and thought beyond their capacity. The gods represent the limit of meaningful inquiry. Before the gods is not a time or a place or a condition that can be described. It is simply before, outside the framework within which description is possible. This philosophical position would produce exactly the kind of silence we find in the record. Not a silence of ignorance, but a silence of epistemic humility, an acknowledgement that some questions cannot be answered and should not be asked. The proper human stance is acceptance of limits, focusing attention on what can be known and managed rather than straining after what lies beyond reach. Wisdom consists in knowing where to stop asking questions, in recognizing the boundaries of legitimate inquiry. Such wisdom seems alien to modern sensibilities. We are heirs to traditions that celebrate the expansion of knowledge, that resist limits on questioning, that see boundaries as challenges to be overcome rather than as legitimate constraints to be respected. We assume that any question can in principle be answered if we gather enough evidence and think carefully enough. The idea that some questions might be inherently unanswerable, not because of practical limitations but because of the nature of reality itself, strikes us as defeatist or obscurantist. But the Sumerians operated within different philosophical assumptions. They did not assume reality was fully transparent to human understanding. They did not assume all knowledge was beneficial. they did not assume inquiry should be unlimited. They built a sophisticated civilization on the foundation of these assumptions, suggesting that epistemic humility is compatible with remarkable achievement. You do not need to understand everything in order to function effectively. The Sumerians understood enough to build cities, develop writing and mathematics, create art and literature, organize complex societies, and maintain these achievements for over a millennium. What they did not understand did not prevent them from flourishing. The morning light would reveal this flourishing in tangible form. Fields stretching to the horizon, green with growing grain. Canals running straight and full, bringing water from the river to places where rain alone would not suffice. Workshops producing pottery, textiles, metalwork, each craft perfected over generations of patient refinement. Markets where goods from distant regions appeared alongside local products. Evidence of trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. Temples rising above the surrounding buildings, their facades gleaming with plaster, their interiors cool and shadowed, spaces set apart for communication with the divine. All of this existed without anyone needing to know exactly how it began. The farmer planting his field did not need to know who first domesticated wheat. The weaver at her loom did not need to know who invented weaving. The merchant conducting trade did not need to know when commerce first emerged. They needed to know how to perform their tasks correctly, how to maintain the systems that supported them, how to pass their knowledge to the next generation. Origins were irrelevant to these practical concerns. Even at the highest levels of society, the absence of origin narratives did not create problems. Kings could legitimate their rule through divine selection and proper performance rather than through descent from mythical founders. Priests could maintain their authority through ritual knowledge and temple control rather than through claims about original revelation. Scribes could preserve their status through literacy and technical skill rather than through connection to the inventor of writing. Each role justified itself through function rather than through origin story. This functional justification proved remarkably durable, as long as the system worked. As long as fields produced grain and cities remained stable, questions about origins did not become urgent. Only when systems begin to fail do people typically turn to origin narratives, seeking to understand what went wrong by understanding how things began. A civilization experiencing crisis might look backward, trying to identify the moment when the true path was lost, the golden age from which decline began. The Sumerians, in their long centuries of relative stability, did not face this pressure. They had problems, certainly conflicts and disasters, but nothing that required them to fundamentally rethink their relationship to the past. The floods came and receded. Harvests varied but never failed completely. Conflicts with neighboring regions flared and subsided without existential threat. The system absorbed shocks and continued. In such circumstances, conservative approaches prove themselves. Innovation carries risk. The known, the tested, the traditional offers safety. Better to do what has worked before than to experiment with untried methods. Better to preserve than to transform. This conservative impulse becomes visible in the archaeological record through subtle patterns. Tool types remain consistent across long periods. Construction techniques show gradual refinement but rarely revolutionary change. Settlement patterns evolve slowly. Burial practices maintain continuity. The material culture of Sumerian civilization gives an impression of stability, of people doing largely the same things in largely the same ways generation after generation. This is not stagnation. It is equilibrium, the maintenance of a balanced state that proves sustainable over long periods. Equilibrium requires energy to maintain. It requires conscious effort to resist the pull of entropy, the natural tendency of ordered systems to decay into disorder. The Sumerians invested enormous effort in maintenance. Canals had to be cleaned annually or they would silt up and become useless. Levees had to be repaired after floods. Walls had to be rebuilt as mud brick deteriorated. Fields had to be managed carefully to prevent salinization. None of this happened automatically. It required organized labor, centralized coordination, collective commitment to preservation. This commitment to maintenance shaped social organization. Large populations had to be mobilized for public works. Authorities had to have enough legitimacy to command labor and resources. Systems of accounting and administration had to track obligations and ensure fairness. The state emerged not from conquest or philosophical principle but from practical necessity. Complex irrigation agriculture required complex social organization. The two evolved together, each enabling the other. In this view, civilization is less a conscious achievement than an emergent property of particular ecological and social conditions. You cannot have cities without agricultural surplus. You cannot have authority structures without legitimating ideologies. Each element depends on the others. Remove any piece, and the whole system becomes unstable. The Sumerians inherited this system or developed it so gradually that no single generation experienced it as invention. From the perspective of any individual, civilization simply was. It existed as background condition, the air you breathed, the water you drank. You did not think about it any more than you thought about the fact that the sun rose each morning. It was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked as far as anyone could remember or imagine. This taken for granted quality of civilization helps explain the absence of origin narratives. What is simply there, obvious and unquestioned, does not require explanation. Only when something becomes strange, when its presence is no longer automatic, does it become an object of reflection and narrative. For the Sumerians, civilization was not strange, it was normal. Origins only become interesting when the present feels disconnected from the past, when continuity breaks down and people need stories to reconnect them to what came before. The Sumerians maintained continuity successfully enough that this break never fully occurred. Yes, there were disruptions, periods when particular cities declined or dynasties changed, but the underlying civilization persisted. The language continued, the gods remained, the basic technologies and social structures endured. Each generation could see themselves as continuing what their ancestors had done. The thread remained unbroken, or broken only briefly before being retied. This thread ran through physical space as well as through time. The landscape itself was saturated with history. Every field had been worked by previous generations. Every building stood on the ruins of earlier buildings. Every canal had been dug and redug countless times. You could not walk through a Sumerian city without treading on the compressed remains of those who came before. The past was literally underfoot, layer upon layer of it, pressing down on the present, supporting it and constraining it simultaneously. Stand in the temple precinct in the hour before dawn, when the world balanced between darkness and light. The air was cool, carrying moisture from the river, clean and fresh after the stuffiness of the previous evening. The stars were fading, but the sun had not yet appeared. In this liminal moment, the priests would begin their first duties, lighting lamps, preparing offerings, chanting prayers in voices trained to carry across stone courtyards. The words they spoke were ancient, some of them so archaic that their exact meaning had blurred, but the sounds remained carefully preserved, transmitted across generations of ritual specialists. The meaning lived in the performance rather than in intellectual understanding. To speak these words correctly, at the right time, in the right place, was to maintain connection with the divine, to ensure that the gods remained present, that the city remained protected, that the cosmic order remained stable. This ritual preservation of forms whose original meaning had faded is one of the most striking features of Sumerian religion. Language changes, words shift in meaning, grammar evolves, but religious language resists these changes. It becomes frozen, archaic, increasingly distant from everyday speech. This creates a two-tier linguistic system where ordinary people speak one way and religious professionals speak another. The religious language becomes a marker of specialized knowledge, a signal that the speaker has access to realms ordinary people cannot reach. But this also means that much religious content becomes opaque even to believers. They participate in rituals whose words they do not fully understand. They trust that the priests know what the words mean, or at least know how to use them correctly. Meaning becomes less important than correct performance. The ritual works not because participants understand it, but because it follows the prescribed pattern. This prioritization of form over meaning extends from ritual to text. Scribes copied religious texts with extreme care, preserving every detail even when those details had ceased to make sense in current language. A text might contain words no longer in active use, grammatical constructions that had become obsolete, references to practices that had been abandoned. These elements were preserved anyway because the text as a whole was sacred. To alter it would be to break the connection it maintained with the divine realm. Over time, this produced collections of texts whose original context had vanished. Hymns to gods whose primary worship centers had declined continued to be copied because they were old and therefore authoritative. Myths explaining obsolete rituals remained in circulation. The archive grew through accumulation, each generation adding to what came before but rarely subtracting. The result was a vast textual tradition that no single person fully understood, a tradition that had to be approached through interpretation and scholarly inquiry. This textual obscurity might seem like a weakness, but it also created flexibility. When meaning is unclear, interpretation becomes possible. Different scholars could read the same text differently, could find new relevance in ancient words, could adapt inherited material to present needs without overtly changing it. The texts remained stable while their meanings shifted, allowing tradition and innovation to coexist, but there were limits to interpretation. Some texts were too important, too central to be reinterpreted freely. These texts, particularly those associated with key rituals and major gods, became canonical. Their wording was fixed. Deviation was not permitted. These texts anchored the tradition, providing stable reference points around which more flexible interpretation could occur. The absence of origin narratives among these canonical texts is therefore significant. It suggests that such narratives either never existed or were never considered central enough to require this level of preservation. The gods themselves, as they appear in the preserved texts, show little interest in explaining their own origins. Divine genealogies exist, but they are fragmentary and contradictory. Some gods are said to be older than others, but there is no comprehensive account of how the gods came into being. They simply are, eternally existing, forming a community whose internal relationships are complex. Even Nenwo, sometimes called the mother of the gods, is not clearly described as existing before all others or creating the cosmos from nothing. She is part of the system rather than its external creator. This lack of divine origin stories parallels the lack of civilization origin stories. Just as civilization appears already functioning, so the gods appear already organized into their pantheon. Both social and cosmic order are given rather than generated. They exist as facts to be acknowledged rather than as achievements to be explained. This parallel suggests a deep coherence in Sumerian thought, a worldview in which origins generally are not the focus of interest or concern. The focus instead lies on maintenance and proper relationship. Humans must maintain proper relationship with gods through ritual and offering. Kings must maintain proper relationship with their subjects through just rule. Cities must maintain proper relationship with their agricultural hinterlands through effective management. Each node in the network has responsibilities. The system functions when everyone fulfills their role correctly. It fails when relationships break down, when obligations are neglected, when balance is lost. This relational rather than originative thinking shaped Sumerian ethics and social norms. What mattered was not where you came from but how you behaved. Your standing in society depended on fulfilling your assigned role competently. A good farmer was not someone who could explain the origin of agriculture, but someone who produced good harvests. A good priest was not someone who understood the ultimate meaning of rituals, but someone who performed them correctly. Goodness was functional, measured by outcomes rather than by philosophical understanding. This pragmatic ethic extended even to intellectual pursuits. Mathematics developed not as abstract contemplation, but as practical tool for measurement and accounting. Astronomy served calendrical needs rather than theoretical curiosity. Medicine focused on effective treatments rather than understanding of underlying causes. The Sumerian mind was oriented toward application rather than pure theory. Knowledge justified itself through usefulness rather than through correspondence to ultimate truth. In such an intellectual environment, questions about origins would have seemed less urgent than questions about method. How do you measure a field accurately? How do you predict the flood? How do you treat disease? How do you resolve disputes? These questions had practical answers that could be tested and refined. Questions about ultimate origins, by contrast, led nowhere practical. They could not be answered definitively, and the answers, even if found, would not help anyone plant better crops or build stronger walls. The evening meal would bring families together around simple food, barley bread and onions, perhaps fish or dates depending on season and fortune. Conversations would turn to the day's events, to gossip and news, to planning for tomorrow's work. No one would discuss cosmology or origins. These were not topics for ordinary life. Were they were discussed at all, it would be in specialized settings in scribal schools or priestly chambers by people whose roles required engagement with textual tradition. For most people, such abstract questions never arose. Life was full enough without them. This does not mean the Sumerians were intellectually incurious. They were capable of sophisticated abstract thought as their mathematics demonstrates, but curiosity was channeled into productive directions. They asked questions that could be answered and whose answers made a difference. They developed impressive technical knowledge in multiple domains. They created rich literary and artistic traditions. They built a complex civilization that functioned effectively for over 1,000 years. None of this required origin narratives. The silence around beginnings, then, reflects not a gap in knowledge but a different set of priorities. Sumerians were solving different problems than later cultures would solve. They were building and maintaining rather than explaining and justifying. Their intellectual energy went into practical challenges rather than metaphysical speculation. This made them successful as a civilization, even as it leaves us, their distant heirs, puzzling over questions they never thought to ask. As night settled fully over the city, lamps would burn in wealthy households, while poorer families made do with firelight or darkness. The sounds of the day would fade, children would be settled for sleep. Adults would rest, gathering strength for tomorrow's labor. In this quiet, in the space between consciousness and sleep, perhaps some lay awake wondering about larger questions. Perhaps some did ask themselves how this world came to be, whether their city had always stood, whether the gods had always ruled. But if such thoughts arose, they remained private, unspoken, leaving no trace in the written record. The tablets preserved what was useful for the collective, not what was merely curious for the individual. The moon would rise, its phases marking time as they had marked time since before anyone could remember. The same moon had shone on the first Sumerian cities. It would shine on their ruins. It did not explain itself. It simply was, following its path through the sky, indifferent to human attempts to understand or narrate its origin. In this way, the moon was like civilization itself, a presence so constant that it required no justification, no origin story, no explanation beyond the simple fact of its existence, and the patterns it revealed to patient observation. The Sumerians lived within cycles that required no explanation because they were experienced as eternal. The flood came annually, not as catastrophe but as expected event. The grain grew according to its season, the stars traced their paths. Within these cycles, human life found its rhythm, and that rhythm had been established so long ago that no one questioned it. To ask when the cycle began would have been as strange as asking when a circle started. The pattern simply was, and the task of each generation was to remain synchronized with it, to plant when planting should be done, to harvest when the grain was ready, to perform rituals when the calendar demanded them. This cyclical consciousness shaped memory in ways that made linear historical thinking difficult. Events recurred rather than progressing. Last year's flood resembled the flood before it. This harvest echoed previous harvests. Wars followed familiar patterns of conflict and resolution. Within this repetitive framework, the particular details of any single event mattered less than the pattern it exemplified. A drought was not a unique catastrophe requiring historical documentation. It was an instance of a recurring possibility, one of the variations the world cycled through. The appropriate response was not to record it for posterity, but to perform the rituals that would encourage the gods to restore normal conditions. The weight of this cyclical thinking pressed down on any impulse toward historical consciousness. If everything that happens has happened before and will happen again, then the chronicling of specific events loses urgency. What would be the point of recording this year's harvest in detail when it was essentially the same as last year's and next year's? The cycles made history repetitive, and repetition made detailed historical record-keeping seem redundant. Better to record the pattern itself, the template that governed repetition, than to document each individual instance of the pattern's manifestation. This may help explain why so much Sumerian writing is administrative rather than narrative. The administrative text records the general system, how things are supposed to work, what the standard measures are, who owes what to whom. These records document structure rather than event. They describe the framework within which cycles operate rather than the cycles themselves. A single administrative tablet about field measurements tells you more about the enduring system than 100 tablets chronicling individual harvests would. The Sumerians were writing about structure because structure was what mattered, what needed to be preserved, what allowed the cycles to continue functioning. Origins disrupt structure. They introduce singularity into systems that operate through repetition. An origin story says this happened once, at a particular moment, and changed everything. But if your worldview is based on cycles, on eternal return, then such singularities become problematic. They don't fit. They suggest that time had a beginning, that the cycles themselves started at some point, that the pattern governing existence was imposed rather than eternal. These implications carry theological and philosophical weight that the Sumerians may have found troubling or simply unnecessary. The gods in their eternal realm existed outside human time. They were not born in any sense that humans understood birth. They simply were, had always been, would always be. Their interactions with each other might unfold in sequences that resembled time, but divine time was not human time. A story that took place in the divine realm could not be dated according to human chronology. It happened in eternal present, always already occurring. When these divine events were narrated in myth, they were not being placed in history. They were being described as permanent features of cosmic reality. This divine eternality meant that the order the gods established was also eternal. The cosmos was not created at a point in time. It was the ongoing manifestation of divine will that had no beginning because the divine had no beginning. Civilization, as part of this cosmic order, participated in the same eternality. It too had no beginning in the sense that would satisfy a historical question. It was an aspect of how reality was structured, as fundamental as the distinction between heaven and earth, as essential as the separation of fresh water and salt water. When the Sumerian King List says that kingship descended from heaven, it is not describing a historical event. It is describing the nature of kingship as a cosmic principle. Kingship did not begin. It was revealed, made manifest in the human realm, but its essence existed eternally in the divine realm. The descending of kingship is not a moment in time but a feature of reality, the way political authority connects to divine order. To ask when this descent occurred is to misunderstand the nature of the claim being made. The cities themselves were thought to have divine origins in a similar sense. A city did not begin when humans first settled there. A city existed first as an idea in the divine mind, and the human settlement was the material realization of that eternal idea. Eridu, considered the first city in many Sumerian traditions, was not first in time but first in priority, primary in importance, the archetypal city from which all others derived their pattern. Its foundation was not a historical event but an ontological fact, a necessary feature of how cities relate to cosmic order. This understanding made it possible for multiple cities to claim primacy without contradiction. Eridu was first. Uruk was first. Nippur was first. Each was first in a different sense according to different aspects of priority. Eridu was oldest in tradition. Uruk was largest and most powerful at certain periods. Nippur was the religious center where gods assembled. These different kinds of primacy could coexist because they were not competing claims about historical sequence. They were claims about cosmic significance, about different ways a city could embody divine intention. The landscape held memory in forms that did not require narrative. The old canal beds, even when dry, showed where water had flowed. The tells, the mounded ruins of ancient settlements, marked where people had lived. These physical traces were sufficient memory. They did not need stories attached to them. You could see that the world had been inhabited, that cities had stood and fallen, that water had taken different courses. The evidence was visible in the land itself. To demand written narrative on top of this physical evidence would have seemed redundant. Walk through the countryside in early morning when the dew still clung to grass and the air had not yet grown hot. The land was flat, featureless in some ways, but to eyes that knew how to read it, every slight rise spoke of buried buildings, every depression marked an ancient canal or well. The soil itself was archaeology, containing within its layers the compressed remains of thousands of years of human activity. Sherds of pottery from eras long past worked their way to the surface with every rain. The ground gave up its dead constantly, casually, without ceremony. Memory was not hidden, it was ambient, present in the very substance of the world. This ambient memory perhaps satisfied whatever need for historical knowledge the Sumerians felt. They could see that the past existed. They were surrounded by its traces. The tell on which their city stood had been built up through centuries of continuous occupation. The temple they maintained had been rebuilt dozens of times, each rebuilding raising the platform higher, adding to the mass of previous construction. The past was literal foundation. It supported the present physically. There was no mystery about whether earlier generations had existed. Their existence was solid, measurable, present underfoot. What was not present was narrative connection to those earlier generations. The physical trace proved existence but did not explain it. You knew people had lived here before, but you did not necessarily know who they were, what they had thought, why they had done what they did. The gap between physical trace and narrative understanding yawned wide. The Sumerians chose to live with this gap. They did not attempt to bridge it with speculative origin stories. They accepted that the past existed but was not fully knowable. Certain knowledge was physical. Other knowledge had been lost with the generations who held it. This acceptance of lost knowledge reflects a mature understanding of what can and cannot be recovered. Memory has limits. Oral tradition distorts over time. Physical artifacts tell us structures existed but not what they meant. The Sumerians experiencing these limits directly seem to have concluded that full historical recovery was impossible. Rather than constructing speculative narratives to fill the gaps, they focused on preserving what could be preserved, their own contemporary records, their current understanding of how things work. They documented the present for future generations rather than attempting to reconstruct the past for themselves. This forward-looking rather than backward-looking orientation gave Sumerian record-keeping its characteristic flavor. The tablets are not nostalgic. They do not long for a lost golden age. They do not frame the present as decline from a better past. Instead, they focus on maintaining what exists now, on ensuring that current systems continue to function, on transmitting to the next generation the knowledge needed for survival. The past is honored through this commitment to continuity, not through narrative reconstruction. The laments that survive, those poems mourning destroyed cities, show what happened when continuity broke down. The city falls silent. The gods depart. The temples stand empty. Life ceases. These texts express profound grief, but notably they do not seek explanation. They do not ask why this happened, or attempt to identify the historical causes of destruction. They simply mourn what was lost. The tone is elegiac rather than analytical. The city is gone. The proper response is sorrow, not inquiry into causation. This acceptance of loss without explanation again reflects the Sumerian worldview. Events happened because the gods willed them. Divine will did not require justification. Human understanding had limits. You could experience disaster, could feel its effects, could mourn what it destroyed, but you might never understand why it occurred. The gods had their reasons, or perhaps disaster simply was part of the cycling of cosmic order, the necessary downswing before the next upswing. Either way, human inquiry would not penetrate to ultimate causes. The night sky in its vast indifference reinforced this sense of human limitation. The stars moved according to laws humans could observe but not control. The moon waxed and waned on its own schedule. The sun rose and set regardless of human action. The cosmos operated according to principles that predated humanity and would continue after humanity ceased. Within this cosmic context, human concerns were small, local, temporary. Civilizations rose and fell. Cities were founded and abandoned. Knowledge was gained and lost, but the stars continued their courses unmoved by these terrestrial changes. This cosmic perspective may have made questions about civilization's origins seem less urgent. Civilization was a human concern, important to humans but not to the cosmos at large. The gods cared about civilization because they had established it, because they needed humans to perform rituals and provide offerings. But the gods' perspective was not human perspective. What seemed monumentally important to humans might be minor adjustment to gods operating on cosmic scales. The beginning of human civilization might not be a significant event requiring commemoration. It might be simply a small change in the administration of earthly affairs, worth noting but not worth elaborate mythology. The professional scribes who created and maintained records operated within institutions that had their own priorities and limitations. A scribe worked for a temple or palace. His job was to serve the needs of that institution. Those needs were primarily administrative, recording transactions, tracking resources, documenting obligations. When scribes did create literary texts, these texts served institutional purposes as well, legitimating the authority of gods or kings, providing ritual scripts, teaching scribal students. There was little institutional need for comprehensive origin narratives. Such narratives did not help manage granaries or organize labor. They did not support any practical institutional function. In the absence of institutional demand, individual scribes had little motivation to create origin texts. Writing was difficult, materials were valuable, and time was limited. A scribe would not undertake a major composition without some expectation that it would be valued, copied, and preserved. If the culture did not value origin narratives, if there was no audience for such texts, then scribes would focus their creative energies elsewhere. They would compose hymns that could be used in rituals, wisdom literature that could guide conduct, epic tales that embodied cultural values. Origin narratives, apparently, were not among the genres that Sumerian culture rewarded with preservation and recopying. The educational system reinforced this selectivity. Scribal students learned by copying texts that their teachers considered important. They copied administrative formulas, mathematical tables, literary classics. What they copied shaped what survived. If origin narratives were not part of the curriculum, they would not be copied by generations of students, would not benefit from the preservation mechanism that kept other texts in circulation. The educational system acted as a filter, determining which texts would have hundreds of copies and which would disappear. This filtering process was not neutral, it reflected cultural values and priorities. The texts that survived were the texts that teachers chose to assign, and teachers chose texts that served educational purposes, that taught important concepts, that provided models of good writing, that were acknowledged classics. A text about origins would need to achieve classic status to be included in the curriculum. Apparently no such text did, or if such texts existed, they did not achieve the cultural prominence that would ensure their preservation through the educational system. The clay tablets themselves had their own materiality that shaped what survived. Clay is durable but also fragile. Tablets could last thousands of years if baked or accidentally fired in building destructions. But unbaked tablets dissolved in water or crumbled over time. The tablets that survived were often those that were stored in institutional archives, in temple or palace libraries where they had some protection from the elements. Personal documents, text that circulated outside institutional contexts, had much lower survival rates. If origin narratives existed, but circulated privately rather than institutionally, they would be much less likely to survive to the present. The archaeological recovery process added another filter. We find what happens to be preserved in sites that happen to have been excavated. Enormous amounts of material remain unexcavated. Entire cities have barely been touched. Water tables have risen in many areas, making excavation difficult or impossible. What we have is a small sample of what once existed, and that sample is biased toward institutional contexts because those are what archaeologists prioritize and what tends to be better preserved. The absence of origin narratives in the surviving corpus may reflect these preservation biases as much as original cultural patterns. Yet, even accounting for all these filtering effects, the silence remains remarkable. With thousands of tablets recovered, spanning a millennium of Sumerian civilization, across multiple cities and institutional contexts, the absence of clear origin narratives stands out. If such narratives were common or important, we would expect at least some traces to survive. We have myths, epics, hymns, laments, wisdom literature, and countless administrative texts. We have enough material to get a sense of what was important to Sumerian culture. And consistently across this large corpus, origins are not directly addressed. The indirect references that do exist reinforce the pattern. Kingship descended from heaven. The gods assigned roles and responsibilities. Cities existed because the gods willed them. These statements gesture toward beginnings but do not describe them. They assert divine origin without narrating the process. They treat beginnings as facts to be acknowledged rather than stories to be told. This pattern of assertion without narration characterizes Sumerian treatment of origins across multiple contexts. Perhaps narrative itself was seen as inappropriate for certain kinds of truth. Narrative implies sequence, causation, change over time, but some truths were not sequential. They were eternal, existing outside time, true always and everywhere. For such truths, narrative would be misleading. It would impose temporal structure on what was actually atemporal. Better to state such truths directly, without narrative elaboration, preserving their eternal character. Divine truths particularly might require non-narrative expression. The gods existed eternally. Their natures did not change. Their relationships were permanent features of cosmic structure. To narrate these relationships would suggest they had history, that they could have been otherwise, that divine reality was contingent rather than necessary. By avoiding narrative, by treating divine relationships as given facts, Sumerian texts preserved the sense that these were eternal truths rather than historical developments. Civilization's origin might have been understood similarly, not as an event that happened in time, but as an eternal truth about how human society relates to divine order. Civilization was not invented, it was revealed. It did not begin. It was established as part of the fundamental structure of reality. This understanding would make narrative treatment inappropriate. You do not narrate eternal truths. You acknowledge them, teach them, build your social practices around them, but you do not tell stories about them as if they were events with beginnings and endings. The sound of reed stylus on clay would have filled the scribal rooms, a scratching chorus, as dozens of students copied the same text simultaneously. The teacher would circulate among them, correcting errors, modeling proper technique, emphasizing the importance of accuracy. These students were learning more than writing. They were learning values. Precision mattered. Tradition mattered. What had been handed down deserved respect and preservation. Innovation was not celebrated. Faithfulness to the model was what earned praise in such an educational environment. The absence of origin narratives would perpetuate itself. Students learned what they were taught. They copied what their teachers assigned. When they became teachers, they would assign the same texts, perpetuating the curriculum they had received. Unless someone with significant authority deliberately introduced new texts, the curriculum would remain stable across generations. Origin narratives, if they were not already part of the curriculum, would never be added. The system reproduced itself, and in reproducing itself, it reproduced its self-ins as well as its content. The social conservatism of scribal culture reinforced this reproduction of tradition. Scribes were professionals who derived their status from specialized knowledge. They had incentive to maintain the difficulty and specialization of their craft. Writing systems were kept complex, requiring years of training to master. Access to texts was controlled. Literacy remained restricted to a small professional class. Within this closed system, innovation was not rewarded. A scribe who invented new genres or composed radically different texts would not gain professional advancement. A scribe who perfectly mastered traditional forms would. This professional conservatism meant that Sumerian literature remained remarkably stable in its generic conventions. Hymns followed established patterns. Myth used conventional language and themes. Even the epics, which show more creativity than most genres, operated within recognized boundaries. The system produced refinement within tradition rather than radical innovation. Over centuries, texts became more polished, more sophisticated in their use of literary devices, but they did not venture into entirely new territory. The absence of origin narratives was therefore not something that would be corrected over time. It was a stable feature of the literary system. The gods themselves, as portrayed in surviving texts, seemed uninterested in explaining themselves. They acted but did not justify their actions. They commanded but did not persuade. Their authority was self-evident, requiring no foundation in narrative. When gods spoke in myths, they did not give their autobiographies. They issued orders, made pronouncements, engaged in conflicts with other gods. Their personalities emerged through action rather than through explanation of their origins or natures. The texts assumed readers already understood who these gods were and what they represented. Background was not provided because background was assumed. This assumption of shared knowledge creates problems for modern readers who lack that background. We come to the texts without the cultural context that would have made them immediately comprehensible to their original audiences. We need explanations that the texts do not provide because those explanations were supplied by the broader culture in which the texts circulated. A Sumerian hearing a hymn to Enlil would know who Enlil was, what he controlled, why he mattered. That knowledge did not need to be stated in the hymn. The hymn could simply address Enlil directly, praising his attributes and petitioning his favor, without introductory explanation. For us, reading these texts in isolation from their cultural context, the lack of explanation creates gaps. We piece together divine characteristics from multiple texts, trying to construct a coherent understanding of the pantheon. But we can never be sure we have it right. The texts were not written to be self-sufficient. They were written for people embedded in the culture, people who brought enormous amounts of tacit knowledge to their reading. Without that tacit knowledge, we struggle to understand what would have been obvious to the original audience. Origins may be part of that tacit knowledge. Perhaps every Sumerian child learned the basic origin stories as part of normal enculturation. Perhaps these stories were told orally in context that left no written trace. Perhaps they were so well known that writing them down would have seemed redundant, like writing down that water is wet or that the sun rises in the east. If origin knowledge was part of shared culture transmitted orally across generations, then the absence of written origin narratives would not indicate absence of origin knowledge. It would indicate that such knowledge did not need written preservation, because it was secure in oral tradition, but oral tradition dies with cultures. When Sumerian ceased to be spoken, when the culture was absorbed into broader Mesopotamian civilization, the oral traditions went with it. Later cultures preserved Sumerian texts but not the living context that gave those texts meaning. The tacit knowledge was lost. If origin stories lived primarily in that tacit realm, they would be irrecoverable now. We would have only the written traces, the fragments that were deemed worth recording, and those fragments would not include origin narratives because such narratives were not part of what needed written preservation. This possibility is frustrating because it means we may be looking for something that existed but left no trace. The silence in the written record might not reflect silence in the culture. It might reflect the division between what was written and what was oral, between institutional texts and popular knowledge, between professional scribal compositions and everyday storytelling. The Sumerians might have had rich origin traditions that simply operated in domains that did not produce written texts, yet even this explanation has limits. Other cultures with strong oral traditions nevertheless produced written versions of their origin stories. The transition from oral to written often includes capturing foundational narratives in permanent form. Cultures typically want their most important stories preserved. If origin narratives were truly central to Sumerian culture, we would expect some written versions to exist, even if most of the transmission was oral. The complete absence suggests either that such narratives were not as central as we assume origin narratives should be, or that they existed in forms we do not recognize, embedded in texts we have but which we misread because we lack the cultural competence to understand what they are really saying. The second possibility is worth considering. Perhaps origin content is present in the texts we have, but expressed in ways we do not recognize because we are looking for the wrong things. We expect origin narratives to look a certain way, to follow certain generic conventions established by later traditions. But Sumerian origin expression might follow entirely different conventions, might be embedded in ritual texts or administrative documents or hymns in ways that would not be obvious to readers trained on later mythological traditions. The King List itself might be an origin document that we misread because we bring wrong expectations to it. We see it as flawed history, when perhaps it is functioning as origin myth expressed through the form of a king list. The impossibly long reigns before the flood signal that this is not ordinary history. They mark this section as belonging to a different order of time, a mythical time when the world operated differently. The post-flood section, with its more plausible reigns, marks the transition to historical time. The list as a whole might be narrating the origin of historical kingship from mythical kingship, using the form of an administrative document to carry mythological content. If we read the King List this way, as a sophisticated genre that blends administrative form with mythological content, then it becomes an origin text after all. It tells us that kingship originated in heaven, descended to earth, was exercised under different conditions before the flood, and continues under current conditions after the flood. This is origin narrative, just not in the form we expected. It uses the conventions of bureaucratic documentation, the list format, the assignment of specific reigns, to convey theological and cosmological claims about the nature of political authority. Other texts might function similarly, embedding origin content in unexpected formats. Hymns that describe divine attributes might be encoding origin information in their descriptions. Administrative texts that list cities might be presenting those cities in an order that reflects origin sequence even if that sequence is not explicitly stated. Mathematical texts that present calculation methods might be preserving knowledge of how measurement systems were established even if they do not narrate that establishment. The information might be present but in forms that resist narrative extraction. This would align with the Sumerian preference for embedded, performative, procedural knowledge over explicit, narrative, explanatory knowledge. Rather than telling you where something came from, a Sumerian text shows you how it works. The functioning reveals the origin implicitly. You understand that writing originated because you learned to write using methods that trace back to original development. You understand that agriculture began because you follow agricultural procedures that embody accumulated knowledge from the earliest farmers. The procedure itself is the preserved origin, not needing separate narrative articulation. The silence around beginnings might therefore be a feature of how knowledge was encoded rather than an absence of knowledge. The Sumerians had ways of transmitting origin information that did not require explicit origin narratives. They embedded that information in practices, in institutional structures, in the very forms of their texts and documents. To access that information, you had to participate in the culture, to become a scribe or priest or farmer, to learn by doing rather than by reading. The written texts supported this learning by providing models and references, but they were not self-sufficient. They required the living context of practice to be fully meaningful. When that living context died, the embedded knowledge became inaccessible. We can read the texts, but we cannot fully understand them because we cannot recreate the practices and institutions within which they functioned. We are like someone trying to understand a map without ever having seen the territory it represents. The map preserves certain information, but much of its meaning depends on correlation with actual landscape. Without that correlation, the map remains partially opaque. The Sumerian texts are maps whose territory has vanished. They preserve information, but we can no longer walk the ground that would make that information fully comprehensible. The clay under the stylus would resist and yield simultaneously. Press too hard and the clay would stick to the reed, distorting the mark. Press too lightly and the impression would be too shallow to read. The scribe learned through practice to find the right pressure, the right angle, the right rhythm. This bodily knowledge could not be fully captured in written instruction. You could describe the technique, but description was no substitute for years of practice that trained hand and eye to work together automatically. The written text could remind the trained scribe of proper form, but it could not create skill in someone who lacked training. Much Sumerian knowledge probably had this character. Texts were reminders and references for people who already knew. They were not meant to teach from zero. They assumed basic competence and built on it. A ritual text assumed you already knew the general structure of rituals and were consulting the text for specific details of this particular ceremony. An administrative text assumed you understood the economic system and needed only the specifics of this transaction. A hymn assumed you knew the god and the theological framework and were using the hymn as a script for worship. None of these texts were introductory. They were all advanced, specialized, technical, origin narratives, if they existed, might have been considered too basic to need written form. They might have been part of the introductory knowledge that everyone was expected to have before encountering written texts. By the time you reached the level of literacy, you would already know the origin stories, because you would have learned them orally as a child. Writing them down would be like writing down the alphabet for someone who was already reading complex texts, unnecessary and somewhat insulting to the reader's level of knowledge. But this creates the puzzle of how origin knowledge would have been transmitted in early childhood or early training. Who would have been responsible for that transmission? Parents teaching children? Perhaps, though parental teaching typically focuses on practical skills rather than cosmological narratives. Priests during religious festivals? Possibly, though the surviving ritual texts do not seem to include origin narratives as part of their scripts. Teachers in schools? But the school curriculum, as far as we can reconstruct it, focused on literacy and numeracy rather than mythology. The transmission mechanisms for basic cultural knowledge remain obscure. We know such knowledge must have been transmitted because the culture functioned and reproduced itself, but we have little direct evidence of how this transmission occurred. The written record captures only the higher levels of knowledge, the specialized and technical. The foundational level, the level of shared cultural assumptions and basic narratives, operated below the threshold of literacy and left few traces. This division between foundational oral culture and advanced written culture might have been deliberate. Restricting literacy to a small professional class required maintaining a distinction between knowledge available to everyone and knowledge available to specialists. If origin stories were part of common culture, available to everyone orally, then they would serve a different social function than specialized texts available only to literates. The two levels of culture would complement each other, the oral providing shared identity and basic worldview, the written providing technical knowledge and institutional memory. In such a system, origins would appropriately belong to the oral level. They were too important to be restricted to specialists. Everyone needed to know where they came from, what their relationship to the gods was, why civilization existed. Such foundational knowledge could not be locked up in written texts as accessible only to scribes. It had to circulate freely in oral form, transmitted through rituals, festivals, storytelling, and everyday conversation. The written texts could take this knowledge for granted precisely because it was widely available through other means. The collapse of Sumerian civilization would then explain the loss of origin narratives. When the oral culture died, it took those narratives with it. The written texts survived because clay is durable, but the oral knowledge that contextualized those texts vanished. Later scholars reading Sumerian texts, whether in ancient times or in modernity, would miss the oral component and find the written texts puzzling in their silences. We are separated from origin knowledge not because it never existed but because it existed in a form that could not survive cultural collapse. The stars would emerge one by one as twilight deepened into night. The farmers returning from fields, the merchants closing their stalls, the children herded indoors, all would pause occasionally to glance upward at the emerging patterns. The constellations were stories in themselves, images traced across the sky. Some of these stellar patterns had names and myths associated with them, but most of what was known about the stars was practical. That group marks the season for planting. That one rises before dawn during flood time. The stars were calendar and clock, more useful than mystical, yet even this practical knowledge contained layers of inherited wisdom. The observations recorded in astronomical texts represented centuries of careful watching. Individual scribes copied and extended tables that previous generations had compiled. The knowledge accumulated slowly, each generation adding small refinements to what had been received. No single person invented this system. It emerged through collective effort across time. The origin of astronomical knowledge was thus distributed across many people and many years, not traceable to a beginning point but rather emerging gradually from sustained attention to celestial phenomena. This gradual emergence might characterize civilization itself. There was no moment when it began, no first day of civilization. Instead, there was a long process of development, of small changes accumulating, of practices becoming established, of institutions solidifying. The process stretched across enough time that no one generation experienced it as invention. Each generation made small modifications to what they inherited, and those modifications eventually added up to something recognizable as civilization. But from the inside, from the perspective of any individual or generation, it felt like continuity rather than creation. If civilization emerged gradually rather than beginning sharply, then the absence of origin narratives makes perfect sense. There was no origin moment to narrate. There was only gradual transformation spread across so many generations that no one could identify when the crucial changes occurred. You could not say this is when civilization began because there was no discrete moment. Only slow transition from one condition to another. Narrative requires events, requires moments when things change. But if change was gradual and continuous, narrative structure would be difficult to impose. Better to acknowledge that civilization exists without claiming to know how it began. The morning would arrive with birds calling and light spreading across the eastern sky. People would wake to another day, another repetition of tasks done yesterday and the day before. The shepherd would lead his flock to pasture. The potter would center clay on her wheel. The scribe would take up his stylus. The priest would chant the dawn prayers, each person performing their role, fitting into the larger pattern, maintaining the system that supported them all. This was civilization, not in its mythical origin but in its daily operation. The beginning, if there had been one, was less important than this continuing present. This moment of sustained coordination, this collective effort to maintain what had been built. And so the clay tablets remain, pressed with careful marks, hardened by time, silent on the question we most want answered. They tell us how civilization functioned, how resources were managed, how the gods were honored, how disputes were resolved. They give us fragments of stories and poems, glimpses of how people thought and felt. But they do not tell us when or how it all began. That silence is the Sumerian gift to us, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some knowledge is lost beyond recovery, that civilization exists whether or not we understand its origins. The tablets endure, speaking of maintenance and endurance, of systems that outlasted their creators, of forms preserved across millennia. They show us that the beginning, whatever it was, matters less than we might think. What matters is what continues.